started.
Yep, let's get that. Oh, I'm making so much noise for all the people this morning.
Is Jill going to say something?
Yes, I think that's right, Johnny. Yeah, she's going to say. It's making so much interesting sound. Turn it on.
Hello. Yes, she can use this one.
Great.
Just remember to turn it off.
Okay, sounds good. And let me. I can hear that mine is doing something, but do you think it's picking up my voice? Medium.
We will see.
Okay. I am talking. It says low battery, or no, it says on. Well, it does have a red.
It's supposed to be on. If you just talk.
Okay, talking a little bit, saying some things, testing out the sound of my voice, which so far is going. I can a little bit hear it. Maybe it just needs to be. Do you think it wants to be on my head? It makes sound every time I move it. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'll be up there. So you can
On the head. I will try. I might be loud enough to make this room work. I'm pretty loud. I think it might be better.
But maybe for the stream.
Oh, for the streaming. You're right. We will need it.
Do you think so, Johnny? We need it for the stream?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Cool. I'm gonna try. See what you mean. It really wants to go over my ears. I so don't want it over my ears. It's gonna give me a headache. I'm sorry. I just know my body. Hi. You know, could I hold that for the streaming? That might be easier than.
If you can hold it, fine with me. I asked Johnny.
See how Johnny feels. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think this is gonna. I don't mean to be that picky speaker, but I can't wear this on my head or I'm gonna get a headache. It's just not something I don't tolerate. Extra. Once I have all these glasses on, I just can't do more.
You can use
Okay. We'll both use the handheld mic. I think that'll work. That'll work better. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm sorry to be. It's just not a good fit for my body. So. Okay. Good. Test. It's super hot. Okay. It's good.
Is it okay if I introduce you in Norwegian?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'll find what I know myself. So that's. It's true. We've got a lot of context on this one. This will actually be very informative. Yeah. It's a perfect Norwegian site. Skal vi bare begynne med?
Hei, dette er Kate McDowell, som er gjesteforsker denne måneden på Senter for digitale fortellinger oppe på Universitetet i Bergen, som jeg er nestleder for, og det er en glede for meg å få introdusere Kate. Kate har, vi jobber jo med digitale fortellinger, og vi elsker å samarbeide med bibliotek, men jeg tror Kate er den første hos oss som faktisk har doktorgrad i Information Sciences. Hun kan bibliotek inn og ut. Og det å få Kate med oss for å få et virkelig spennende blikk på hvordan data og det å samle og prøve å formidle fortellingen til det fellesskapet vi lever i. Hvordan det er en kjempeviktig oppgave som bibliotek faktisk er veldig godt egnet til å gjøre. Det har vært utrolig inspirerende å ha Kate hos oss i noen uker, så jeg er veldig glad for at vi får dele henne. Nei, at hun er her, og at vi også får innspill her fra mange gode bibliotekarer. Vær så god, Kate.
Talk. Thank you so much, Jill. And Unskul, I cannot speak Norwegian. I apologize. It's a beautiful and difficult language. So thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you, Jill, for that lovely introduction. I'm here to talk with you. I feel far from you, but I'm not far from those, I think, on the live stream. So we'll pretend I'm a little nearby and we're having a conversation. I have a lot of time with some of you here today. So just briefly, there'll be those of you who are here for the talk, which is just about an hour, and then we'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for questions and conversation, just to open it up and have some dialogue. And then I'll be here also for a workshop where we'll dig into some of your very own library data, which is exciting, I hope, and some of my approaches to finding the data needed for a good story and finding the story that we can make from data, the ways that we can interpret data to make that make sense. Where I'm starting today, I know your library has had some specific projects in misinformation, so I emphasized that a bit more in this talk than in some others that I give. But where we're starting today, I just want to tell you about this image that's up on the screen. This was our recruiting image for the launch of the grant project that I will tell you about just a little bit later. It's the data storytelling toolkit for libraries. And we decided to change the name to libraries because it doesn't matter to me what your job is as a staff member, if you're technically a librarian or technically staff or a library worker of any kind. Everyone is welcome. It's really all the same as far as the tools go. So the mission of that project is to build this data storytelling toolkit that will support, really we're focusing now on public libraries. The second grant in the series has been turned in. This is nationally funded in the United States, which I'm sure you know from other colleagues and friends. It's a great honor, and I always say a lot to live up to as well for that kind of funding. So we support libraries. We want to use data libraries are already collecting. I think this is very important because a lot of training programs for data communication have not focused on what's already available. We're interested in, I'm interested in, my whole team is interested in storytelling. We want to talk about how we create stories together and the process of refining stories through sharing information. So we do have data visualization, of course, as part of this work, and advocacy is key. So now let me stop and tell you how we define storytelling. So storytelling in the tradition that I come from is probably very similar to some of the traditions that you all come from in this room, although, you know, it depends. Is anyone here in the children's department doing children's library work? Hey, good morning. So that is where I come from as well. Many years ago, I was a public children's librarian, and this model of storytelling comes out of the storytelling tradition in libraries and also the folk revival tradition of storytelling in the United States. So the idea here looks very simple, and in some ways it is that there's a connection between each of these elements, and they are not static elements. The teller is not static. The teller tells the story in different ways at different times. The audience is not static. The audience listens in particular ways. They understand the story from their own vantage point, and the story is not static. We argue, and I'll tell you more about the theory in a minute, that the story can be the same story, accurately told, but can be told different ways over time. And of course, this seems obvious when you think about it. And yet, so many people who engage with data, we've found in our research, have concerns about story and the ways that story might confuse or distract from the reality of the data. What we found is that there are ways to tell the same story accurately, but in different ways over time. And one other thing I'll mention here is that the audience, for example, has a third vantage point in addition to the lines that connect. The audience can see the line that connects the teller to their story. And this is an important line because it lets you know why this person knows what they know. So I have a brief agenda for what I'll talk about today. We'll just this will be thought exercise until we get to the workshop part. First, we'll talk about data and data storytelling. Then we'll talk a bit about audiences. I find in my experience, many people will say you should know your audience, but they don't tell you how. I will tell you what I think you can know about how. And then we'll talk about narrative structures. And this tends to be, I think this is a very important part, to have some classic narrative structures that our research has shown work for nonprofit storytelling generally, libraries being one case within this larger public service work, storytelling. Okay, so how do I know things that I know? I come from this tradition, and it's a humble tradition. The emphasis is on the story, not the storyteller. The storyteller is the vehicle for the story. And the way that that story comes through with beauty and wisdom and humor, we hope is for the listeners, not for ourselves. And this fits very well, I've found, with service traditions in various ways, public traditions. These three amazing women, Augusta Baker in the top right was the first storytelling specialist at the New York Public Library. This tradition goes back 130 years. The first person was Carolyn Hewins in the amazing hat. I'll come back to her because she also has some data storytelling things to tell us. And this was my mentor, Betsy Hearn, who came from the University of Chicago and herself was mentored by Zena Sutherland. Zena Sutherland created the first textbook for children's literature. So even though this comes out of children's traditions, what we find so far in the research is that actually the things that work for children work because they are memorable stories. And we need to be able to remember data stories. It's not just to have the data rush by in a blur and then we forget everything later, but to be able to remember them and not just remember, also retell them so that the impact of what we say goes beyond the first telling. So I've done some work. This is the slide where I always feel a little, I don't know, it's a bit much. I've done some work consulting with different organizations, and it's been a great honor to do this work. I was especially honored and also kind of scared when the Pan American Health Organization reached out to me during the pandemic for help, because I thought, oh wow, if we're down to me, a former children's librarian, we might be in trouble in this pandemic. But it was really terrific. I worked with them on misinformation, of course, and on identifying misinformation. I was part of a team doing algorithmic detection of misinformation. That's not my area, the algorithmic detection. My area was figuring out how then could we position public health authorities, workers, people every day trying to communicate with people in their communities. How could we position them to be effective storytellers with the misinformation we were detecting? Yeah, so I've done some, lots of different kinds of work. The third kind of work is inventing these courses in ethical and accurate information communication that we call data storytelling. With this team and actually a few more people, I should have added more to this slide, we now have brand new 2 more people hired. We have a team of 9 people working on teaching data storytelling in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. So that's a lot of exciting work to do. We've been doing this since 2017. We think we were the first people to teach data storytelling courses. They've popped up all over since in business and journalism. We've seen them come up, but we didn't find any courses before ours in 2017. If you find that I'm wrong, please tell me. I'd love to know that. That'd be helpful. So, real quick, I'd like to ask a little bit about you all in the audience, and that is if you could raise your hands for me with your comfort levels. So you have 4 choices. Data, top comfort level. Story, that's where you're most comfortable. Both, that's a fine answer too. Or neither. Everyone is welcome. It could be any of these answers. So I'll kind of go through and maybe just do a quick show of hands. How many for data? That's your first comfort zone. Yes, thank you. How about those for story? First comfort zone. Great, thank you. How about both? That's several hands are already going to go up twice. Yep. And neither. Somebody where it's not. That's great. Everybody's comfortable with something today. That's good. So we define data storytelling as any presentation of data using narrative strategies in story form. And this definition in the abstract is very broad, and it doesn't mean as much until you see kind of the tools for how we get into it. So let's move forward into that, and I'll show you what I mean by data storytelling with some examples from the class and from history. So you can be thinking about what kinds of data you have as evidence of library value, and I have some ideas about that for us too when we talk later. Coming back to Carolyn Hewins just briefly, she was the lead person who introduced the systematic gathering of evidence to librarianship at a time when women were 20% of the profession. They were not allowed to speak at conferences, even. And they created a qualitative series of reports based on national surveys. Their research model became the research model for public library work in the United States, and it changed the field. It introduced this collaborative model of discourse. I like to think of her as an early data storyteller, because rather than being able to even use her voice, she went around that restriction and found ways to use other voices gathered systematically in order to communicate. And sometimes that's what we do. In fact, we do this all the time. Here's an example from a real library. Surveys often lead to new technology investments. And then if we do our jobs well, not only do we make the new investment, we also tell a story about it and maybe get the media involved and are able to further discuss. And hopefully, I always like to think the story doesn't even end here, that the story carries on, because the users who take advantage of these technology investments then have the opportunity to tell you back what's working for them as you continue to evolve the investments that you make. So we teach data storytelling, and it started from a student who told us that she had been taught in actually statistical training. Jill, I was thinking back to our conversation, in her statistical research, statistical degree that she did on statistics, that she was taught to think of people as numbers by looking at who lived and died with the sinking of the Titanic in relation to their ticket cost, right? So she felt that she learned that ticket cost and the value of human life somehow went together. And we thought, oh, we have a problem. We have a problem here. And it's something we think data storytelling can help with, because there is a possibility of humanizing data literacy. I won't talk a lot about that research today, but I wanted to show you Ashley's work. Ashley is a staff member at the University of Illinois. She told this, it's a really brilliant story. And so is Justin Martin. This is another story that was told really nicely. Justin showed in the yellow bar the differences between costs for being online for a family in the state of Illinois in 2020. And the differences was a particular region, really, but the differences were that if you could afford, in the first year, if you couldn't afford the full startup cost, to buy the equipment, then you could rent the equipment. And the problem is that yellow bar recurs every year. So that if you're just a little bit poorer early on and you don't notice this cost difference, then it's a much heavier burden going on down the line. It's an important place where libraries play a role. It's also true, though, that libraries themselves are not always equal. And so we had a student who does not want to be named because it was too controversial. And those of you in public libraries will understand, I think, that comparing across libraries can be very difficult, right? They're not, each public library serves a particular place, a particular group of people. Comparisons can be overdone. Sometimes data drives us toward comparisons, and we sometimes have to think about that. But this was a student who did a comparison on purpose, trying to show some of the inequalities in the region near Chicago. And she was able to boil it down into the print materials, ebooks, and programs available for people. Programs for you are, what is it, the word? It's it starts with an A. What? Arrangement. Thank you. That's exactly. Thank you so much. I wanted to make sure that was translated, because that was a difficult translation for me when I saw the data. I was like, okay, I got to remember that. So yeah, that's arrangement for you. Yeah. Okay, so the basic claim of this work is that we've found so far that there's a lot of library data that needs story before storage. And I think this is an understandable problem. Here's a beautiful storage system, right? We are so strong at information storage. We are one of the strongest professions in the world at storing information. We know how to do it. We've developed systems for it. The systems that we've developed have informed all of how information is organized. Our strength is unmatched. And we're overusing that strength when it comes to data. We're storing it. We're not necessarily bringing it back out. So I brought the kitchen here because it's not just that we store the food, right? We also eat it. We also nourish ourselves. We also feed back into our communities. So I will do a brief detour into storytelling as information, where I want to talk about a model from the information sciences that our team has adapted. It's this data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. And the idea is that each level can build on the others. This comes out of computer science in the 80s, but it really goes back to T.S. Eliot in the 30s and a poem. Where is the wisdom that we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge that we have lost in information? And so with this foundation, I came to make this argument that you can find easily, the link is there online, and I'd be happy to share it with you in any other way, that story is a fundamental information form. We tend in information sciences generally to think of information as something that I individually go to a computer and I get it, right? I search for it, I obtain it. There's a lot of interesting research about search and retrieval and linked data and databases and all these things, and it's not to put any of this down. But what I wanted to also assert is that story is central to understanding certain kinds of information, especially the things we do socially and collectively. And I think this, maybe for me, I'm trying to bridge a kind of divide that has emerged between libraries and information science, because libraries are still committed every day to making sure that people know where they're going, what they're doing, what they need. And so we tell stories about what happened, every day to people to help them understand what they need to know. But this has been sort of divided from some of the computational focus on information retrieval and storage. So I like to say in story, wisdom often means discovering a way beyond the ways that seem obvious. And I'll tell a story that somebody from the country of Haiti could tell much better than I can, but I'll try it nonetheless. There was, so this is an example of that wisdom in action. There was once a young girl who overheard her mother having a conversation with a man who was visiting the village. And the man and her mother were talking about the price of sale for her as a servant, and that she would be taken away. And the man said he would bring back the money the next day, and the mother said, I will have Topingi, the girl, ready for you, and she'll be in a red dress, and that's how you'll know her, and you'll be able to take her from the village. I'll send her out, and you can find her and take her. The next day, so Topingi overheard this, and she told her friends, and the next day when the man came to the village, every girl was dressed in red, and all they would say was, I'm Topingi, she's Topingi, you're Topingi too. I'm Topingi, she's Topingi, you're Topingi too. So wisdom can mean ways of doing things beyond the obvious, and it can have a lot to do with making collective meanings. So I framed this DIKW pyramid to bring wisdom into that conversation by thinking now about what is data in relation to story. Well, data is the basis, right? That's the beginning. And what is information? Well, it's interpretation with context, which means data doesn't necessarily drive, right? We hear this in English, we hear data driven, right? It's like it's driving the car. Data don't have the ability to drive, that's us, right? We have to do that. So we have to interpret, and then knowledge becomes actionable information in story. What do we know to do because of what we hear in a story? Sometimes it's as simple as, avoiding a problem, right? Cautionary stories come up all the time, especially in information technology work. It's like, what went wrong when you tried to do a certain kind of setup, right? And so we tell each other that kind of story. And then wisdom is not something I can entirely define. It's why I tell a story to gesture toward it. How could I possibly define all of wisdom for you this morning on a Tuesday? I can't do it. But I think it at least involves which story to tell when and how and to whom, and much, much more. There are these hundreds and thousands of years of wisdom traditions that I have been fascinated by for a long time because they so often center on story, right? We think about story when we think of those traditions. So I promised you I would talk a little bit about misinformation, and I have to do that by telling you a small story. This is Alabama. It's a state in the southern part of the United States. It's where my family comes from. My mother, when she was a child, heard from her grandmother, so my great-grandmother, about the 1918 flu epidemic. At that time, everyone in my great-grandmother's house was sick. She and the children, they were all sick. And so her parents, my many great-grandparents came with food, and they left the food on the porch, and they stayed at a distance, and they would visit, but they would only visit through the open window. That was their visiting space. And so when my mother in 2020 heard about social distancing, she said, oh, I know that. That's what my grandmother told me about for 1918. I mean, what a privilege to have a story like that came down, through my own family. It's a tremendous honor. And then I think about the inequities in the United States, and I don't think it's an accident that my family has had that kind of privilege. We are mostly a white family. We are mostly from, we've gotten by, we've survived, we've had enough money. We haven't been rich, but we haven't been terribly poor either. Just 50 miles away and 40 years later, there was a set of experiments in Alabama that you may have heard of because it is the foundation of responsible, ethical human research. And they are the Tuskegee experiments, where Black men, African-American men, were deliberately infected with syphilis and left untreated, and they were not told that this had happened to them. And this experiment went on a horrifying amount of time. It only was shut down in 1971, which is really too recent to think about. So misinformation has complex consequences. I'm going to skip a little bit here, and I'm going to talk just about this third story today because I want to get to the framework here. If your family has been subjected to anything like this, and this may be the case for some of you, I mean, there are histories of ongoing genocides and holocausts happening even today, right? So if your family has been or is subjected to one of these things, then you might recognize that it's not so much vaccine hesitancy. It's not that medical officials who expect trust and believe that more information is the answer. I mean, I'm in favor of information, don't get me wrong, but more information is not always the answer. If your family has been affected in these ways, it's not that you're just hesitant, right? It's not that you just need to know a little more. If you just get the right messaging, then you'll do the thing of getting the vaccine. No, you're questioning. So I changed the word here of questioning. And this case analysis was really about 3 cases. So we can think about vaccine questioning as a reasonable thing to do if you've had bad experiences with government medical programs. That could be reasonable. You can think about how the triangle could give some insights here. So these are the relationships between the teller and the audience and what kind of relationship is instigated. And you can think about what narrative structures might matter here. And this is where I'll loop back and I'll talk about transformation structure a little bit later. But you could think of heroic people who go through the transformative experience of surviving to tell the story. Someone has to survive to tell the story to know about some of the evil things that happen in this world. So this was the work with the World Health Organization. We were analyzing 3 cases of misinformation, and we were looking at them in a couple of different ways. Ivermectin was, I don't know if you were familiar with the horse dewormer, ivermectin. I live in an area that's very much agricultural, so there's a lot of feed stores and grain stores available there. Ivermectin was a drug that is used just for horses to deworm them, but initially there was some promising insights, some glimmers of data that maybe it was going to be helpful for treating COVID-19. And so people bought this off the shelves, and some people hurt themselves. Some people even died from taking this medication that was not good for COVID-19 once the clinical trials were completed. So it's not just, so these white paper publications, I'm not saying they shouldn't happen or anything like that. Please don't misread, but it's complicated what happens when when early medical information gets out there, when it's not clinically tested. Because we don't have any knowledge yet. Clinical trials are about generating knowledge, right? It's not just data that it might be promising or information that we interpret some patterns, but it's knowledge. We know what to do. We're sure of it because we've tried it. We've tried it carefully. So, and then faked magnetism. This was such a, I don't know what to say about this, but it was so silly, I guess. It's like, it was so silly. People were making these videos just to get the clicks and the likes, right? So now it's not so much about even COVID-19, it's about the internet ecosystem and what it does to human behavior, where people will make up silly stories that can go viral in order to shock the audience and try to get them to kind of try to create this, this emotional activation, and trying to get them to trust the story. So resistance, resisting vaccines became the story there. So from all of this, I built this misinformation framework that has the same 4 components, where we can think about data, fake information. I have my students in class look for misinformation online. It's really easy. They can find it right away. So I asked them to look for this and then to examine the data. Can they find a source for the data, especially data visualizations? And is it that they are faked or are they misscaled or something? Sometimes it's real data, but it's twisted out of context. Other times it's just made up. I can't tell you how many. The majority of examples that my students go to examine will link to fake sites that say there's data backing something up, and there's just no data there at all. There's not even any reality to it. So there's misinformation as an art form, and I think we also have AI contributing now to this, misinformation as an art form of creating, I'm calling it here cultural cues, but I'm really thinking about a study of the aesthetic experience of fake data. Is there anything there that we could look at to say, okay, this is more likely to be fake because of the way that it's presented? I'm not sure yet, but so it's bad data, then bad information. And you can think of this with the ivermectin case. It was bad data, really. The ivermectin wasn't effective, but for a minute it looked like it might be. And so there was this white paper saying, we should explore this case. We should see if this is meaningful. So you could even say the data wasn't bad yet, it was just not complete. But then bad information, it was definitely misinformation to think that that would make it a good medicine to use. So you could say that's the level at which it went wrong. Or maybe even the data and the information could be okay for something where it's like, yeah, that's right, that's good data, yeah, that's good information, but what to do with it is wrong, right? The knowledge is wrong. So what action to take can cause harm. So stories based on false information that lead to ineffective or harmful actions. And then the last one is wisdom. Bad wisdom, I think of as reactivity. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I think actually people who work in libraries with the public get very good at reading the emotional moment, right, in an interaction, especially with someone who might be a little frustrated, a little angry, right? You can read that tone. It's different culturally in every culture, I know that, but we get good at this, right? I mean, it's something we're good at. So I've been thinking about that ability that we have as information professionals in practice, where we're actually already pretty attuned to reactivity in the moment, or the spike of negative emotions, or the escalation of a conflict, right? We think about this, and now probably for you too, there's more literature on trauma in information work. This is something that's being talked about more in the United States, I think partly because of our extreme polarization of wealth inequality and the extreme problems that are resulting from this. It's probably a lot different here in Norway, but I can imagine there's still some times when it's quite difficult to interact with someone who's having a really bad day, right? Just a really bad day. So I think there's something to this misinformation framework, not only that's interesting, but that might be useful. So now I'll delve into my own context briefly, and then I'll come back out. My own context, I'll just sort of give a warning. Some of you may have read about the United States recently and book banning. It is unreal. I'll give you a bit about that, and then I'll tell you more about why I think misinformation can be helpful here as a concept. And what can be done, a few things that are being done about it too. So right now in the United States, we have parents' rights groups that are centering only certain parts of the population. They center homophobic and racist views. They are targeting school and public libraries. I will admit to you, it's because 2023 is complete that I did this. I started to look at the numbers for 2024, and I just decided that I didn't want to do that yet. It's too bad. The numbers are awful. They're worse even now. So tremendous targeting of public libraries is happening. This is happening at the level of book challenges. It's also happening at library boards. So the public representatives, an organized group, will take over the public representation. So we have boards of trustees that are the people who are supposed to democratically align and make sure that people are represented by people on a board that help to oversee the management of the library. This is being taken over by organized groups that want to perpetrate these views that we say people of color. There are many different complicated things about race and talking about race that I won't pretend to even get into today. I'm working on a book that touches on some of this. It's critical data storytelling for libraries, but what I will say is that there are a lot of different words that are used to mean people who are not white. Sometimes people say brown people, or black people, or African-American people, or ethnicities are attached. But what's interesting is that it's a very clear trend in the United States that people of color and queer people, LGBTQ people, are those that are targeted in terms of the books themselves, the authors, and the representation inside the books. So we're in a time of real trouble, and the next phase may be harder to counteract because, of course, it's just getting quiet now, right? People are just avoiding the conflicts, and this is a tactic. So I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I want you to remember the tactic. So here's one more horror slide, and then I'll stop. But each year has had the highest number of attempted book bans since the beginning of the tracking of this information more than 20 years ago. It's certainly not something I ever expected to see in my lifetime. Yeah, so that's where things are. There are people doing some interesting things about it, though. So in Brooklyn Public Library has this project, Books Unbanned. It is a national teen Brooklyn Public Library e-card, and actually they've gone international with it. So anybody, really anybody who signs up, they call it a teen card, but anybody who signs up can have access to their entire ebook collection. That's what they're doing. And I think this is a very, not only an impressive policy and an impressive kind of thing to roll out. And of course, they're in Brooklyn and they have some resources, and this always relies on money. I don't want to pretend it doesn't. It's part of why I do the work that I do, is that we have to justify money for libraries in these ways. But they've got it, they're using it, it's wonderful. And now they're also studying what they're doing. So they're beginning to look at the research to understand what is this accomplishing and how are people using this to sign up for cards. This is part of our story, right? And libraries have kind of complicated stories that can be a little bit difficult to tell. And I use this simple slide just to say, we have questions to answer when we want to tell a library story. Are we talking about the library itself, or are we talking about the people that the library serves? Are we talking about something else? Are we talking historically? Are we talking in the present moment? There are a lot of things that have to be answered. So we come to this project, the DSTL, and I'll show you it live in just a minute. But it is this funded project that was at the beginning. It is a DIY guide to data storytelling for common data uses in libraries. I do want to be very clear and I think humble about this in this moment to say that our research has been focused on the United States. We've done lots of research. We have, I think, good research methods, lots of different kinds of research. But I don't know how much it transfers to other places. I have connected with librarians in South Australia, librarians in Taiwan, librarians in Denmark, at Aarhus Public Library and the Royal Library. So I know some things do seem to resonate, but I think if we built this model, it wouldn't be exactly the same for every cultural context. So I just want to be clear about that. We have also seen some systematic differences between academic and public libraries, and they look a little something like this. So later we'll get into our story goals and narrative strategies. I promise that's coming like at the end in a big way, but I'm kind of gesturing to it now. In the story goals, we had 5 initially because we worked with academic librarians predominantly, and the one that we had to knock out of the running through the research was keep up with other libraries, because consistently, public libraries in the United States, folks would tell us, this is not only not good, it doesn't work because we are different than this other library. We can't compare exactly, but also it's kind of like, for them it was like rude. It's wrong. They said, I think they said it felt icky. Let's see, what was the word? Toxic, disheartening, and icky. I don't know if you have this word icky, but it's, culturally wrong, basically, was the answer there. So we thought, okay, well, that's interesting because I'm also sometimes talking, like in January, I gave the talk for the first gathering of the state data coordinators. These are the people from all 50 states in the US that collect data about libraries. And I was telling them this, and they collect data in order to compare, right? That's what they're thinking is the goal. So here we have a fundamental cultural disconnect even within this space. So anyhow, these are some of the research findings. We've put together these story goals: understanding, serving needs, building on existing strengths, addressing deficits. We put those together with a few common ways of presenting stories. So this is our rubric that's behind the toolkit. And I'm going to pause after I kind of show you this, because I know it's too much to read quick. I'm sure you're very fast readers. I am too, but it's too much to take in quickly. Instead, I want to show you how it works, rather than this is the back end, basically. But the concept here is that if you pick a goal and you pick one of these motivations, let's imagine that you've successfully addressed some deficits, or that you do want to do a little comparing of how you've built on your strengths with other libraries that have similar strengths. Maybe there is a benefit to comparing in a positive sense. So let me I'm going to have to futz around slightly with this, but you can now see that. So this is the toolkit. It is the outcome of a 2-year planning grant. So I don't think it's done, but it's done for now. It's like the version we have now. You can see there's me doing a video to introduce. But quick navigation, it has 4 components. These first 2, audience attitude and narrative structure, I'm going to talk you through those. And they are tutorials. They are like documents where you go in. It's a little bit of clicking to select a part of the tutorial to read, but it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of guidance. The other 2 are completely interactive. So in the motivation and goals, which is where we'll focus next, you get to make that selection, and then I'll show you what it gives you, because it's not just a description of the kind of story, it's actually a template that you can use for building a story. The data viz prototype is still under development. I probably won't go into that today, but I think the thing we're proudest of is, this is really Matt Turk, my co-PI, who did this part. We're proud that you can analyze your data with this tool, but we do not store or capture your data. So we really considered the privacy of the users as the top priority in this data visualization tool. So it's all a temporary online. You can make some pictures, you come in, use your data there, and then you leave, nothing is stored. So how do we do that? That's Matt's realm. He could tell you all about, I can't necessarily, but I'm proud that he managed to figure that out. It's a huge deal. Sorry, I have to find my mouse. Where did I put it? There we go. It's somewhere. Aha. Yes. Motivation and goals. I don't know if you've ever presented. Everybody else can always see your mouse better than you can. It's amazing. So here we're in it. We'll choose a motivation. Anybody want to have a motivation? This is just imaginary. Which sort of general motivation you would want to pick to explore first? Let's do it. It's a really great kind of story to tell when you've done something. So for achievement, one thing that works well, I think, is serving real needs, right? If you can say, we found these needs in our community, we achieved serving those needs, it can be a really good story. And there are 12 different options. You can choose any of them. But so if we put these 2 things together, then what you get is this. This is a summary where you demonstrate that services are successfully meeting needs. And here's the data story format. Now, we know that people aren't going to just plug in words here. We didn't make it like that easy. But you can copy and paste and use it your own way. And the idea, I will say, I think it's a lot better than ChatGPT for libraries. I've tried. Like, it's just not, AI is not there for libraries yet. I don't know that it ever will be. We aren't going to be the bulk, right? Like, the bulk is going to be business focused. The average is going to be kind of corporate focused for the most part. It's not going to be the concerns we have that are at the center. So you have a way to format, and then you have a possible use case and 3 examples for each one. The possible use case, analyzing results from a patron survey. You actually already saw this one, changed our investments in technology. This was that one from Emory University in Georgia in the United States. So the first real story example is always connected to the possible use case. And this fall, I'll be working with a team of students and Martha Kirledu, who's she's the lead evaluation specialist for the National Library LSTA grants. Basically, so Library Services and Technology Act is a a law that's been around for a long time. Anyhow, it gives money to libraries in the largest amounts that are available, which is not large enough, but it's the largest amounts available. So I'll work with Martha to add more data from those library evaluations. So to feed back in the data that's collected and analyzed for evaluating grant projects, we're going to feed that into this toolkit. So it's not just news stories. These are different sources, though. This one is a university's own news story. This one is a library system, a public library system within a region of Illinois. And the last one is the National Public Libraries Organization, Public Library Association. That's our partners on the next grant, is that national group. So that's what it looks like a little bit when you go into this toolkit. And now I'll look at the time. Yeah, I think, let me switch back here. Current slide. Good, okay, yep. So another example, this is from the UK, partly I just wanted to make sure, so sometimes certain kinds of services have to end, and so this becomes a deficit, and you have to justify some work to address that deficit. So in this case, this was the closure of mobile services, and I forgot to say, the advice, I didn't scroll down far enough, the advice also includes data visualization advice at the bottom, so I should have shown you that. At any rate, you've seen these four parts of it, the audiences, and I want to go into the two that I promised I would go into. Sorry, these are in slightly different order, but reach audiences and structure narratives. So quickly, let me walk you through how we think about reaching audiences. Everybody tells you to know your audience. I think these are ways you can do that. So knowledge and demographics. Knowledge means, what does the audience already know? What are they already aware of? That can be very important. And the difference, of course, between a public audience and an executive audience of some kind, and now I think about, in my context, it'll be the library board that has to talk, and in the workshop I'll talk about an instance of misinformation where the mayor in a town told the library director that he could not tell the library board the truth about the size of the library blueprints that were planned for expansion because the mayor had cut them by 25% in secret. And the word got out, and fortunately the misinformation, or the disinformation that the mayor was spreading by lying about the size of the blueprints was turned briefly into misinformation, but was corrected, and unfortunately, it also involved malinformation because the mayor was threatening to fire the library director if he revealed that this information had been. I wish this wasn't a true story. It does happen, though, right? So I've lived in some things, and these are the politics of particular situations. I did have a conversation, I'll very much anonymize it, in Denmark, where I found not the same level of deception at all. I think it's, I'm sorry about my country. That's true. But I did find a situation where a librarian had talked with a politician, and the politician said, what's the difference in cost between ebooks and print books? And, you know, she knew what was being asked there. The question was, why should we invest in ebooks? Because after all, you know, some of that money, as we know, doesn't go directly to the publisher or the author. It goes to the corporate third party. And I get this too. And I have my concerns as well about the way that money travels. But I also have been alive since 2020, when people need to read online and can't always access a physical book. Like, there are reasons why, especially people who are particularly vulnerable. I think we've learned more about vulnerabilities maybe than ever before in these few years. So in that context, what I said to her was, well, you can't just hand over the numbers without more context. You have to say something about the trends in reading since 2020 and the uptick in use of ebooks, to give the number of, like, well, here's the print book number and here's the ebook number, without also saying, but wait, you also need to look at our demand from the people using the services. It's incomplete information. We're so good. I love our profession because we're so responsive to questions. When people ask us, we will answer, and we will answer truthfully. We will answer precisely, right? Precision is our value. We also have to answer contextually and make sure that we don't lose the thread that someone else might not know, that you would need to think about the demand for ebooks. So at any rate, the knowledge of the audience really matters. Demographics are a mixed bag. It is often useful to know something about demographics. It is not enough to know about demographics, though, because the thing about who we are statistically is that it really doesn't reflect attitudes. And attitudes are maybe the most important part of a library services. We need to know what it is that people we're serving want. We need to know what they will appreciate, what they will use, what they will value. So attitudes are complex, and we'll loop back to misinformation briefly, because there are 4 kinds of attitudes that we've identified that all share the same reality, and a 5th kind that does not. So the 4 kinds of attitudes that share the same reality are positive, meaning there's a proposal on the table, let's say, to buy more access to ebooks. Let's use that as an example. It's a proposal to buy more access to ebooks, and the library board is going to make a vote, and they will send this up to the city council with the budget. This is how we're structured. I'm sure it's got to be at least somewhat similar for you guys, probably different names and different, but you know, there's a budget, right? And so you propose more money for a particular thing, ebooks, and if the board is positive about it, then they're going to help to make the case, and it's going to be fairly easy. If some people on the board are negative, or the whole board is negative about it, then you have to find some way to persuade or to find compromises. So it's not keep a calm tone, but the idea is persuasion and compromises and de-escalating conflict wherever you can. Mixed is almost always, this is normal, right? It's normal to have a combination of positive and negative attitudes, but all sharing the same reality still. So when I say negative, what I mean is just that they disagree with the proposal. I don't mean that they disagree that libraries should exist, right? That's a different kind of, that's a polarized argument. That's not sharing the same reality. So mixed is a little bit of both. Indifferent, you've got to try to get people engaged in some way. You've got to try to, speak to their interests. Why does it matter for them? You've also got to slow down and just wait until somebody responds. You just have to wait sometimes, especially live in a room. You just have to give it time. It's very uncomfortable, but that's normal too. Polarized audiences are different, and we're not used to dealing with them historically in libraries, especially, it's really recent in the United States. It's really only since 2016, and I don't have to tell you some of the changes that occurred at that time, right? This is when these things began to happen on a broad scale. So polarized audiences need a different thing. They will not respond to a point-by-point debate. It won't work. They've got a full logic. I think it's good to understand the logic that we are going by, the logic of serving people, the logic of free reading, the logic of what we call intellectual freedom in the United States. That is a good logic to understand. But the debates will not be won by logic, because they are debates about identity and who people believe themselves to be. Right? So if you have a cultural identity that is attached to believing that libraries are harming your children because they're not Christian enough, this is a very common thing in the United States right now, they're not Christian enough. So if you believe that, then you're in a polarized situation where you're trying to actually defund the library. You're trying to take money away from the library, and this is happening. So the goal there is completely different. I hope you don't ever have to do this, but if you do, this is how I'm training people to do it so far. I don't know a lot of people doing this work, so if I'm wrong, you'll have to tell me. I mean, we're still figuring it out, right? Like, it's a very recent phenomenon. It's only barely 8 years. You stay on your message. You never repeat the false information. This was confirmed with the human behavior specialist that I work with at the World Health Organization. I see this mistake all the time. Don't quote the things you don't believe, right? Find a way of saying what is being said without using the same language again. It actually propagates the misinformation. Why? Because the research shows that false news spreads faster than real news. This is a very scary finding, right? So if you're propagating the same language to say, well, it's not that, it's this, you just want to say, we're doing this, right? Or you can call it out. I talked to a lawyer at the American Library Association, and he said, why don't you just call it pro-censorship? Say, oh, okay, well, you're pro-censorship. Well, we're not pro-censorship, Right, it's like, that's what it is, right? So why not say that rather than kind of being too nice about it? We don't do that. I understand, like, that's how you feel. Okay, but we do this, right? We are about free access to information. So don't repeat the false things, and then here's the most important thing. Consider the value of debate strategically, and if the intent is to confuse the voters, then you avoid debate and just keep repeating your message. You do not engage in the debate, because the debate will create doubt, and the doubt creates voters who are like, well, this seems controversial, so I don't know if I should vote for it, right? And then you end up with all of this confusion, and this is deliberate. Steve Bannon, who is in jail for a while at least, who was Donald Trump's first political appointee, is affiliated with a group called Stormfront. He helped to found it. It is a white supremacist group in the United States. He has been very explicit about his goal. His goal is what he calls flood the zone. Flood the zone means create enough noise of disinformation and misinformation and all kinds of chaos that people don't know what to decide because they get confused about what might be controversial. So I hope this isn't coming anywhere else but the US, but we know, you've read history like I have, it's possible. And so for libraries, we have to be ready for some things that we never thought we'd have to be ready for. And it includes using that skill that we have with upset people of staying really calm in the spaces that determine our own funding, because this is really part of what's happening. Okay, so I'm going to skip one more time. There we go, to reach audiences. Let's see, that actually is backwards. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say. So it's not just that you want to tell a story about the importance of the library, the achievements you've made in obtaining enough ebooks that you have really met the demand, right? If you can say that, like, we've met demand within this many holds, right? It's rare. Only the most popular ebooks have this many holds waiting. Most of the time, it's only, you know, a maximum of like 3 or 4 holds at a time. I mean, that's, aside from the most popular, most expensive materials, like, that's a pretty good statistic to be able to offer. You want that to not just be tellable, like you can develop that story, but you want somebody to just be able to retell it, because this is where the power comes in. It's when you can get the funding bodies, the bodies that are, you know, making the decisions, the people who are voting in the musical Hamilton, we call it the room where it happens, right? The people who are voting for proposals, they need to be able to say why they're voting. Okay. This is where I'm going to skip, because I did a duplication that I didn't mean to do it. Oh, except this one thing, audience surveys. Should we do audience surveys? I think yes. I think we should survey people, but you've probably lived in the same reality I have, where the response rates are really low, right? Because there's so much going on in our information world. So, okay, so what do you do with low response rates? So I think partly you think in terms of what's the purpose of the survey. It's not just to collect data. It's good to collect data. I think it's a good idea. But it's also to connect and to build relationships. And so you can think of the responses that you get as the beginning of the conversation. And maybe you follow a survey with a story, a poster, an opportunity for dialogue of some kind, where you say, hey, we gathered this data, we made these changes. What do you think? Maybe it's just a piece of paper at the checkout desk or something. Hey, did you notice we made these changes? We did this for you. What do you think, right? So it's keeping that dialogue going that I think can be important. That's all based on the idea of storytelling as a structure. Okay, so I'm almost turning to questions, but let me do what I promised and talk about structuring narratives. So structuring narratives is both easy and difficult. It's not as hard as it can be sometimes, but the question we ask ourselves is, what is our story's narrative structure? Does it have one? What can we use to make this work? Often we think of the story arc. It's a wonderful way of thinking about a story because it has beginning, middle, end, and all of these different features that make a great story. But it's hard to develop because we really need to start in the middle, figuring out what the sequence is. And that sequence is informational and emotional. And this is why we cannot really practice storytelling alone. We need other people to do this, right? We have to develop a story and then try it with people who are willing to be our rehearsal audiences, because if we get this information and emotion sequence right, they'll be able to retell the story. So what I always recommend is, you're developing this. So you tell this, and you're working, you work from the middle first, and then you tell this story, and then you say to someone who's listening to you in your rehearsal audience, can you tell me back what I just said? Whatever they tell you back, that's the story they got right? That's what they were able to remember. So this is another tip for developing stories. So first, it's the story arc, yes, but always start in the middle. And then let me give you 3 ways of thinking about stories. These are classic. These are based on narrative theory. In fact, I am going to whoop, whoop, whoop. Nope, I can't do it that quickly because I did this thing of including a few extra slides. This is it. So before we get into this, I just want to say these are based on different theories. Transformation is based on Joseph Campbell's work. I'm sure you're familiar. This idea of the hero with 1,000 faces. These heroes were the major religious figures of the world. And these are incredible stories. They're not my story. I'm not a major religious figure of the world. You know, we're not these people. And so there's a weird thing that happens when people tell stories about themselves as hero, that it can kind of fall flat. So continuity stories, we are often this kind of story. This is, we sustain through difficulties. We make it through problems. The library continues to work and serve people even when COVID restrictions mean that it's dangerous to come into the building, because we're not just a building, it turns out, right? We begin to communicate this in new ways. And discovery stories come from one piece of Essed and Roland Barthes, where Barthes talked about the mystery, the intrigue, the sense of the unknown being revealed. And this is incredibly helpful for thinking about when a data story works, because a good data story asks some questions along the way to instigate a sense of suspense, a sense of wonder in the audience. It's not just data, right? So I teach this all the time, and my students will come, they'll be like, there's this graph, and this chart, and this graph, and this chart, and that is overwhelming. An audience can't remember that, they can't retell it, and it's not going to do any good ultimately. So the thing is thinking about how can you make it a discovery process to lead someone from one set of insights from data into a question that leads to another set of insights from data in some way. Okay, now let me switch back. Fortunately, all the slides are here, just not quite in the right order. So let's start with continuity. This is stability. This is the story of equilibrium. We are going to recover after a difficult time. We tell stories like this all the time. The information is about well, let's see, the emotion and the information. The emotion feels like a still pool, and then there's a splash, an interruption, and then it comes to stillness again. And this is a story of what happens when institutions endure over time. They make it through things. You know, there's a funding crisis, or there's a fire in the building, or there's different things that happen. Floods. Our school had a flood one time, and we all rushed down to help save the equipment, and it was really a kind of a lovely moment because everyone in the building came to save the equipment. It didn't matter what our jobs were. I was at the time, I forget which, I had 2 different assistant associate dean jobs. It was one of those dean jobs that I had, and we were all there in our, getting our feet wet, right? Just trying to get the equipment out of the basement as fast as we could. And then also once our feet got wet enough, getting out because of electricity and water. Anyhow, it was a little dangerous. It's also any story of continuity. So this is one of my own academic library of this 20 years of library book plate celebrations. And they were kind enough to let me write an article about this, which I framed as book stories. What are the stories of why people choose books to commemorate their career achievements? Sometimes I wonder, why don't we do this more? I wonder if a public library could do this in some way for communities to commemorate some kind of I don't know, life achievement. I don't know what that would be exactly, but the idea here was that being the bedrock of academic community in part means celebrating the moments when there are things to celebrate. So people are able to give a book plate and to put their name into a book for the library when they achieve tenure or promotion. It's a nice tradition. So that's the first one, is continuity. Second one, transformation. This is the one about heroes. It is about awe. It is about a sense of absolute wonder when a student is able to, despite economic hardships, despite family difficulties, achieve a scholarship and use that scholarship to get through an incredible, graduate school experience and go on to a really successful career. Students here are better supported than in the United States. I think you know this. However, I'll just mention that it can be quite a hero's story. But it does tend to fall flat when we tell it about ourselves, because if I try to tell you that I am the subject of awe, it doesn't work as well. Think how much harder it is for people who don't know libraries like we know them. and we tell them the library is the hero, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work as a narrative structure. What works is to say that the library is the helper and the people who succeed are the heroes, right? The students who make it through are the heroes. That works really well. So in academic libraries, of course, there's clear evidence from data that academic library use increases student success. So just an example story of that. But the students are the heroes, right? The library is great too. Like, we're also really wonderful. But and then discovery. This one is something that really is a process. It's not just a one step. We don't usually look at, it'd be hard to develop a discovery story from like only one kind of data. You need at least two kinds of data to compare the data and be able to say, I see, these two things might correlate, and that could mean something interesting. Can we say it's causal? Not always, but so discovery feels like a mystery story. It feels like this sequence of inquiry starts with like asking a question together with the audience, and often it is a together process where you say, I wonder if this is something you've ever thought about. And then we explore together the uncertainty in the data. Why is it that we're spending more money right now on ebooks than print books, for example? Well, let me show you what we know about that from the demand and the use. But also, maybe over time, we should pivot back to more print books, depending. They have their value. They have tremendous value in terms of the collections. There was recently a survey in the United States that younger people, Gen X and millennials and Gen Z, younger than me, that their use of libraries is much more focused on print books now, which was really interesting, right? It suggested a pivot again. So we don't stay static in these things, and that's what it looks like. This is that same example. I wish I'd done the one about TikTok and book talk. I should have brought the one about book talk here. But at any rate, you've seen this example of we analyze and then we serve the needs. So 3 structures for narratives that last, and I give these 3 structures not because I necessarily know every story that's going to last, but because I know that some of these structured stories have lasted according to a lot of narrative theory, and it does seem to work in terms of the research we've done. We're doing some analysis of the 100 interviews that we've conducted overall in the Storytelling at Work project over all kinds of information professions that we could find, and we're analyzing this summer information technology specialists and fundraisers and library staff, all 3, in terms of how they use storytelling in their work. And we're interested in which narrative structures seem most predominant. These 3 have tested out well so far as the place to start. So we're interested, though, also in these stories that last a long time because they're retold, and they're retold because they are memorable, because we can hold them in our minds. In the United States, there is a story that would have been unthinkable before about 2020, and that was ending late fees at libraries. I don't know where your libraries are with this, and I'm not here to judge. I'm not interested in the judgment at all. I'm just here to tell you that never would this change have happened without this story catching on and being something that more and more libraries decided to take up. And I'll tell you, in my childhood, this would not have happened. Like, it is really not common to think about this at all. So it's been a surprising turn of events to see how many people have picked up this story and changed things. I think the economic inequities in the United States are a factor in that cultural context too. So long term, when I think about the goals, these are ambitious. I don't know if they'll happen in my lifetime, but I think it would be wonderful to cultivate data storytelling expertise in our field so that when communities have data storytelling needs, they could be met at libraries and by librarians. And that really is the end of the talk portion of today's program. This is ways to reach me. My slides always have, and I can fix these slides for you so I don't have the extra ones in the middle I had to skip. I have references. I always like to recommend a couple of books. This is one about data visualization. That's just 2 friends who drew postcards back and forth with each other about the data, about their everyday lives. So if you have anyone who's kind of nervous about data, this is a great place to start. And if you have someone who's nervous about thinking in data story terms, this is a book about counting having value systems, behind it, and it's a very detailed argument about how counting and what counts matter, and how to think about the deciding what counts as a something process. There's also a little bit more stuff I've written image credits, but really where I wanted to get to is these are my collaborators. There's nothing I've said here today that I do alone. Everything I do is with these wonderful people. So I will transition later to the workshop, but thank you so much for just seeing their names with mine. And then again, here's how to reach me. Thank you. Not in charge of that part of the rules, but I'll be happy to follow. Okay, Mike will come to you if there are questions, so yeah. This is good. Now I get my exercise. I've been sitting too still for too long.
Thank you. Thank you for, wow, that's a lot of voice.
I know. I felt that too.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I'm just very curious how, because I hope I understood it well, but I probably didn't. Some pieces. I mean, I'm wondering, like, how do you use this visual storytelling, like you use data and storytelling about data to your audience or to your political partners, or like where does it go? So that's, can I have two? And the second one is, and I don't know if it's relevant, but I'm wondering, like, do you have any stories or inspiration or thoughts about using this data storytelling to promote literature? And how to talk about literature and like kind of what works, because obviously we have all those platforms and all those tools, but sometimes we are very happy with the result and sometimes there's like zero response. So I know it's a huge and like big question, but maybe if you have some thoughts about it, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see if I can find and unhide.
Microphone.
I'm saying nothing of value currently, so that's totally good. So I did want to share this one slide about book talk. So let me go to the second question first, and then I'll come back to who's the audience. So here's an example of a kind of story that I think could be really relevant, of thinking about what do you do when you see other libraries, maybe internationally, I don't know, it doesn't have to be in a particular location, but using certain kinds of social media. Like book talk has become kind of a big thing, and it's certainly something I've enjoyed using to find things to read. Sometimes I find terrible things, and I think that's a terrible recommender. But think about the power of people who are reading experts and literacy promoters and really know what their audiences are likely to enjoy. And this audience we're going to talk about here is the reading public, right? So this is the reading public audience. So it's informed by similar work, and I think that helps to make. In this case, there's a kind of, you could say justification, but it's benchmarking, right? It's saying, okay, other libraries are doing this. We want to be thoughtful, do it our own way, of course, but we want to adapt this practice in some way to make this happen. So that's an example of a way. And it still doesn't give you like what should the stories be, but that's okay. You can fill that in, right? Like this is where I trust your knowledge. Really, I do so much. Not allowed to have TikTok. Okay, yeah, so let's not do that one. It's also going to be illegal in the United States. I don't know if you've heard, that just happened. It's coming up. So yeah, so this is going to be an outdated example any minute now. But let's say we look at Instagram or Facebook or even LinkedIn sometimes. The professional profile of a library, it might be helpful to boost that professional profile by saying, hey, we're also doing these literacy promotion activities, and maybe even you need a good book to read, deciders. So let's talk about audiences now. So there's one kind of audience that is trying to reach people where they are, right? Like at the moment, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen when TikTok is illegal in the United States. There'll be a lot of people breaking the law, I think, is what's going to happen first, because how's it enforceable, right? It's not like Apple. Apple, as a major provider of technology in the US, has a great privacy track record. They're not going to break their privacy track record and risk their corporate profits just to follow the law. I mean, it's such the Wild West where I live right now. It's just so crazy. But this is an interesting kind of question. What is the audience, right? Let's go to a different example. And I don't actually want that one either. What I want is, and I don't want the one I did again and again. I want a different one. Sorry, this is me scrolling around, trying not to be too. Let's go with this one for the moment because I think it's good enough, and you can imagine a similar. There's studies about school libraries with very similar kinds of data, and school libraries and public libraries, of course, have intimate interactions. It's complicated, right? How students get access to reading material. So, in this case, the audience could be easily twofold. One part of the audience, in this case, really is parents, right? The people who care are caregivers, guardians, people who care about children's success and their achievements might be interested in their learning, how they're able to achieve based on these things. I also know this is a culturally specific example because obviously achievement in different contexts means different things. But let's imagine just successfully being able to read, right? And this is something school library data has shown again and again, that success with reading, meaning getting beyond that decoding stage where you're going word by word, samya i norsk, that's how I can't do more than word by word, right? And so you get into this like reading the whole chapter or being immersed in the story. I just had I have good friends who have a 9-year-old, and I gave her a book. She has 2 mothers, and she doesn't often see books about kids like her. And there was a book that I found that was about a kid with 2 mothers who lived on a goat farm. And she and I have this whole joke about goat cheese. Anyhow, it's like our little joke. So, at any rate, it was a goat farm. It had a girl who and also loves science. She loves science. Her whole room she's decorating in a space theme, right? So this was just so cool. I found everything. And she called me multiple times while I was here just to tell me how many chapters she'd gotten through, right? She broke through from the decoding phase to really engaging in the narrative. So you could think of that's achievement, right? That's real achievement. And it's the kind of achievement that makes reading a pleasure for itself without it being something driven by something else. So that's a story, probably not for kids because they don't care that much. But it's a story for parents and Auntie Kate like me, who's the people who care about children. This is also a story though for decision makers. So I think of the people, and you'll know better than I do who they are in your context, who decide how much funding the library is going to have. Usually it's this year in my context, right? So every year the library puts forward a budget, the director has to do this. It is tedious work. It's not easy. It's a long, detailed, complicated justification for all of the funding. It's usually based on historical practices of how the funding has been justified before. It is honestly not my favorite kind of data, but I've read a lot of these because it's important for me to understand them to be able to have these kinds of conversations. That audience is interested in this story for a totally different reason. They want to know, if they fund the library, what are the results likely to be? And this is where you say, we're good at this, we practice this, we have these great events for children and families to help them find which books to read, also help them just appreciate literature and culture, help them to have joy in their culture, right? Of all different kinds of cultures, help them to bring a sense of joy to that. Those kinds of justifications then start to line up with the numbers on the spreadsheet and what kind of numbers are going to be spent. So I am talking about at least those 2 kinds of audiences. The third kind of audience, so now we've talked about the public, we've talked about the parenting public, let's call it that, but it could be, I'm in there too, because this 9-year-old is very close to me. But the public in some sense, and then we've talked about decision makers on the other hand. There's a third kind of audience in the middle that are the analysts, the experts, and this is where we're often rehearsing our stories, is with other people a bit like us at our professional levels. They know enough to understand the data we're talking about, and they can help us be better at translating it either to, Angelica Loduca from Italy and I have a paper on this, but it's either to, we call it executives, people who are going to do decision-making work, so executives who are going to execute something, or to the public. There's also the professionals who are the people in the middle. So there's at least those 3 kinds of audiences that I work with in my thinking, and I kind of blurred them together here, knowing in part knowing I'm going to learn from you as we go into this workshop phase, because you'll know better than I do what these audiences are like for your context. What I can say is I think at least those 3 categories are valuable, but there might be more categories that you would tell me about too. So is that a good start? Thank you. Would anyone else like this microphone? We've still got a little bit of time, amazingly. Yeah, so.
Yeah, maybe I should just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a visiting researcher also at the Center for Digital Narrative, and I'm from Denmark, Aarhus University, and I've worked a lot with mainly Danish public libraries, but actually also in a project that included this library, and worked a lot with electronic literature, or digital forms of literature, with Roskilde Library and Bergen. And so my question is sort of related to what you said about misinformation and understanding information. And I would say one of the things, when when we tell the story about why libraries should worry about digital literature or electronic literature, it is also about understanding the internet, platforms like Google, but also Facebook. How are texts composed in these platforms, and now you also mentioned AI. So who's saying what, and how can I judge this, evaluate this? So my question is sort of on that level, where does the library come into the picture? Because I know, at least I assume the same is the case here in Norway, that in Denmark there is a growing interest in working with AI because there's a public interest. People have all tried ChatGPT and are curious about what kind of text is this and where is it coming from, and how can I evaluate it? What should be trusted and what shouldn't, and how do I figure that out? And all these kind of things. So yeah, I'm curious for your comment on this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a fantastic set of comments and a really good question. So I'll go back. This won't solve all the problems, but I'll go back to here to think about this together with you. Because what it brings up for me is this this matrix of decision making around goals and motivations. So I think libraries do have significant roles in combating misinformation for at least 2 reasons. And one is that they're building on their strengths of already being a trusted institution by a large percentage of the public in many places. And so when the library says something, I remember this has been going, libraries have been doing this forever, right? As we've changed digital formats, but even before that, as newspapers began to be collected in libraries in the first place in the 19th century, it's a long tradition of libraries modifying what they offer in relation to the information technology of the day. And I like to think of that as a kind of, it's a negotiated evolution, right? It's not just that it evolves, right? We are part of it, but it's a negotiated evolution, what role the library has in that. There's another reason why, and you pointed to this, I think there's a real need to understand AI, and right now there's this complicated thing going on, and Soren, you know this well, and I live here too, and some of you probably do as well, where people are expressing a lot of fear about AI. I'll overhear this in coffee shops, people, and they'll be talking about the concern, that decisions are going to be made for us. And, in some places that's a really important concern. I will say that the algorithmic driving of policing in the United States has been shown to be actively racist, right? So it will discriminate against certain groups, not because those groups have necessarily done any more wrong, but because the previous police officers also discriminated, and so the data show trends of discrimination, and so the discrimination trends just continue. So I think there are some things to be very concerned about with the implementation of algorithms. I think with AI, in particular ChatGPT and large language models, the thing that people need most that I see is to understand what is and isn't intelligent about those models. And I do think that's a place where there could be some real needs that could be understood and served by the library by showing, like I do this in my classes in my own way, and I think I may have even told you this at some point, but what I do in my classes is I come in, it's data storytelling class, right? So we're gonna learn data storytelling. So I pull up ChatGPT and I have it write the syllabus. And then we look at the syllabus together. And then I show them the syllabus that I wrote as an expert, and we compare. And I say, oh, you know, it's pretty good here, and here it's completely missing the point of what I'm trying to teach you. Like, I'm trying to teach you to interpret data, not just to assume that data is going to make all the decisions for you, but of course it's just averaging language. And in the average business speak about data, the language is, you can just have it make all your decisions for you, right? Which is foolish and wrong. But, you know, I didn't invent, you know, any of that. So I just show up and try to help them understand the differences. So I wonder, I don't know, the real answer to your question then becomes like how, right? And that's interesting. That's something I'd like to think more about, because it would certainly vary from community to community, but I can imagine some kind of event or gathering or even website presence that would encourage people to ask certain kinds of questions about what they know and see about AI and what it is and what it means and doesn't mean. I think it's weird because actually people get scared by the experience of going online to a chatbot and being able to have something that feels like a conversation. My personal opinion is that shows you how really patterned most conversations are. They're not very original. So that's okay. Like, we're just humans. It's all right to be us. But that's why it mimics that conversationality so well, in my opinion. And then when we talk about really inventing ideas or controlling things, I think that's where we could look at this from another direction and talk instead about algorithmic feeds and where information is controlled by probability rather than by human decision making. And what are we gaining and losing by that? I think sometimes we gain some things. Right now, there's a lot of implementation of algorithms for driving information organization. I have a doctoral student who's working on local news bureaus and the ways that local news has been forced in many cases to comply with Facebook's requirements for news sharing, which requires certain kinds of metadata, and it's a lot more work. And these are already understaffed places in the United States. There's this massive corporate takeover in my lifetime of news organizations that have become owned by a very few corporations, and their narrowness shows, if you're aware of that. It's part of what creates this very dangerous and unstable political situation that we're in as a country. And unfortunately, that impacts the whole world. I'm sorry for my country. I didn't make this up. But I think these are the kinds of answers that I find really interesting. It's like, where are there control mechanisms that are happening in relation to, I guess I'm always interested in information, right? That's really where I land. But where is the information being controlled? And then I think what you talk about with public literature experiences, right? That starts to put control in the hands of people, and they can begin to understand more maybe than they do already about what is it that they're interacting with when they interact with just the internet. Sometimes that much is interesting to talk about. I remember trying to draw pictures of the internet for my students in like the 90s, you know, and it was hard then too. It was kind of difficult to do, but it was worth trying. And now it's so much harder, but I think it's still worth trying, you know, thinking about can we use this? Fundamentally, a lot of it is driven by language. Can we use the language experiences that people are having as a way of creating an opening for their understanding? That would be a fun conversation to have. So I don't know the answer yet. Thank you so much. I think we hit time during that. That was such a great question. I enjoyed so much. Thank you so much for your attention and time here today. I really appreciate getting to be with you. So, thanks.